Very good morning to you on this holiday Monday morning. I take it some are still sleeping in, some are still snoring, but we are live on the fifth connection. Theo is still taking a break and he'll join me tomorrow. But this morning we would like to continue in our study of what it means to think well. We have been looking at this issue over the past couple of mornings, and I think there is a dearth of thinking well in the believing community. Somehow we do not enjoy taking time to reflect, to contemplate, and to think deeply about the questions of daily life. And then life zips right by us, and we are shocked. We are startled. We are sometimes scared, spitless, because we aren't engaging with reality. So this morning, I'd like to continue this discussion, this talking point on what it means to think well. Our last time saw us engaging around John chapter 14 and verse number 6. With Jesus as the true and living way. There is a way to think well, and the scriptures presents that way to think well. We looked at Hebrews 5:12 from verse number 12 onwards to verse number 14, and much more, of course, will need to be said on what it means to train the senses. But this morning, I want to focus in on Christ as the way. If he's the way to truth, if he is the embodiment of truth, what significance does that hold for me? And so I want to extend the discussion into that direction, because Jesus is engaging with his disciples and they are quite startled. Well, extremely startled, because he has just said to them that, listen, boys, I'm on my way out. And they are totally smitten. They are confused. They are deeply struck by what he said. And that's why he responds in verse 1 of John chapter 14, let not your heart be troubled. He ends off in the same chapter in verse 27 saying, let not your heart be troubled, neither let them be afraid. Your hearts are not to be afraid. If you believe in God, you believe also in me. And then in verse number 29, I have told you before, it takes place, so that when it does take place, you may believe, that you may take care of ultimate reality. You may engage with the ultimate reality, because I am that reality. I am leaving you. And so when Jesus calls for the calming of the confused, to ultimately care about the service of the triune God, not only in their midst, but not only in their midst, but in their own lives. He reveals himself as the true and living way, because he is the way to the Father that calms the confused as they ultimately care, as they ultimately trust him. So these words of John 14, verse number 6, in the storyline, one needs to spend time poring over them, because Jesus, as the way to the Father, works the works in his followers during his absence. And if he's the true and living way, then there is something about him and encountering him that is extremely significant. And this encounter with Jesus as the way happens between Acts 2 and what is often called the Apazo. the return of Christ, the coming of Christ. In many traditions, it has the idea of Jesus catching away the saints. And so between Acts 2 and the Apazo, this following of Jesus as the way is very, very crucial and extremely significant. I hinted to this idea that Jesus is the Tao within Mandarin and Cantonese. Mandarin, of course, is the predominant speaking language in China, in the East. Lao Tzu was the philosopher that wrote a book encouraged, or entitled rather, the Tao Te Ching. And the Tao Te Ching, the Tao, the word Tao means the way, or the way things are. The word Te is the power or the virtue, the moral excellence that comes through agentic attunement for your arena. You are in touch with what is happening around you. You are attuned to your arena. And Jing means a book or a classic. The Tao Te Ching. And the text is divided into two halves. The Tao section and the Day section. The way section and the power of that way. And that is why today we talk about the way as a flow state. Now, do not run away from these descriptions or these words. Just because they come from the East, do not attach any woo-woo kind of surprise that this is spooky stuff because it's Eastern. Wow, it's amazing how much in our Western stuff that is spooky, that we actually believe, the superstitions we are given to in the West. The way is a flow state. It is a moment by moment, what I would call a moment by moment transformative adventure of becoming what God desires for us to be. We are in the process of becoming, and it is a great adventure. It reminds me of the Steve Curtis Chapman song. This is the great adventure. Saddle up your horses, he says. Well, the path and the purpose is one at the same time, the direction and the destination. The way is not only a path to follow, it has direction, it also has purpose. It's headed for a destination. And this path and purpose is embodied in Jesus. It's kind of what in the East would be called, the Far East, the yin and the yang. In Chinese, the yin means the female drive, and that's the yin. It's the feminine and represents darkness and coldness and passivity, while the yang is the masculine aspect and represents light and warmth and activity. And so in the martial arts, for example, the martial artist is relaxed and adaptive in his movement. He's listening to his opponent. That's the yin part. So his strike is powerful. That is the yang. Well, when we step into the scriptures, if Jesus is the true and living way, then he is the embodiment not only of the path, but also the direction, the purpose that we have to have in our own lives. I am the true and living way. And this, it's interesting to check the I am statements in the Gospel of John, because there are a number of them throughout the Gospel of John where translators have been sort of over-explaining, because often the word is just I am, with no explanatory word or words that follow. Here it is, Jesus says, I am the way. There's a predicate here. There's a descriptor here. I am the way. About 8 or 9 times in the Gospel of John, Jesus just says, don't be afraid, I am. And for many people, that sounds awkward. But you see, if we study the text, we need to ask the question, what is the significance of Jesus saying, I am? I exist, I was, I am, and I will be. It's like Exodus 3 verse 14. Moses says, what do I say when they ask me who sent me? And God says, tell them, I am sent you. I should be what I should be. I will be what I would be. Very, very significant words. I am the way, the truth, and the life. It's a singular descriptor made up of 3 words. I am the true and living way. Now, what I'm going to do with the time that we have left is track you through those 9 times, very briefly in the book of Acts, where the Christian life is described as the way. Now, only twice in the New Testament is this descriptor mentioned. It is mentioned in Antioch, where believers are first called Christians. And it was a derogatory term. It was a pejorative term. They are little Christs. And then in 1 Peter 4, verse number 19, that Hebrew epistle, written to Hebrews, written to Jews, it follows the same trajectory as the word Jew, because the word Jew was used in the exile to describe the Hebrew people from the vantage point of outsiders. Outsiders describe these Hebrews as Jews. The Gentiles in Antioch described believers as Christianoi, as Christians. But the overwhelming descriptor here in the book of Acts is followers of the way. It's about a way of living. The Tao is a way of living. Acts chapter 9, verse 2. Paul gets converted on the road to Damascus. And he has letters to the synagogues at Damascus. Why Damascus? Well, it's this northeastern region north of the Mount Hermon, or Mount Hermon, as we would say. And Mount Hermon, without going into great detail here, was considered in the ancient Near East the citadel of Satan. Paul is on his way to Damascus with letters that would authorize him to bind, to imprison, to take prisoner men and women belonging to the way. And so there's a gospel witness right at the heart of the citadel of Satan. The city of Damascus is very significant in a biblical cosmology, the gateway to the portal of the underworld. Acts 16 is the second mention of the way of salvation. Acts 16:17. It's a girl who follows Paul. And she says, these men are the servants of the Most High God who proclaim to you the way of salvation. So those words are in the mouth of an unbeliever, and she describes these men, Paul and his company, proclaimers of the way of salvation. Acts 18:25, Paul instructs Priscilla and Aquila. Aquila had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he was fervent in the Spirit, the Bible says, Acts 18:25, and then in verse 26, when Paul hears them, it says, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, when they hear Paul, right, they took Priscilla and Aquila aside and explain to Aquila and Priscilla the way of God more accurately. Why the way of God? The emphasis on what we call the Christian life is described as the way. Verse 9 of chapter 19. There's an accusation that these men are speaking evil of the way before the congregation. In verse 23 of chapter 19, at that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. Acts 22 verse 14, Paul says, when he stands before the judgment seat when he was captured, he says, I persecuted the way to the death. Then in verse 14 of chapter 24, but this I confess to you that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers. Then in verse 22, when Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, he put them off saying, when Lysias the tribune goes down, I will decide your case. And so twice in chapter 24, the Christian position is described as the way. Why the way? Because you see, the Christian life is not about following 10 rules and 2 techniques and 613 laws. It's about following Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. And while we are given in the early stages of our Christian life to prescriptions and propositions of what we should be believing and what we ought to believe, we must be given to an understanding here that we have to develop and break out of that cocoon eventually so that we can live wisely. It's not about 10 rules, 2 instructions. It's about following Jesus as the embodiment of truth. He is the true and living way. And when you want to encounter truth, you have to engage with him as the true and living way. And following him as the way is where it's at. The discovery of truth is a journey. It's an adventure. Enjoy the ride. And so as I sign off this morning, contemplate this singular fact that Jesus, as the true and living way, is the one whom you need to encounter. May God bless you and have a good day.